But we are excited to get started on this live Q&A about our backlog grooming and sprint planning. We are here to answer some questions such as, can you add stories to a sprint? How often should the backlog grooming occur? Who decides the duration for grooming product backlog? And more. So whether you're watching live or if you're tuning in after the fact for the recorded version of it, we want to make sure we answer all of your guys' questions about backlog grooming. If you have a question during it live, you can raise your hand or you can go ahead and type it in the chat, and I will make sure that we get your questions answered. And we will hand the time over to Brandon and Colton.
Yeah, so maybe we could just do a quick introduction, kind of what we do here at Zibtek, just to get that started. So I'm over the sales team, VP of sales. I have a pretty extensive background in sales, a lot in startups, which we do get a lot of startups coming through. We also do staff augmentation. So custom software services. We have a team currently of about 80 plus developers. We have a office here locally in sunny Silicon Slopes, Utah, or Salt Lake City, Utah. And then also Bangalore, India is where our operations center is. So that's me. And then there's also Colton on the call.
Yep. Thanks. Yep. My name is Colton Seitz. I'm the director of client success over here at Zibtek. Basically, my role is I oversee all of our projects, work with all of our project managers or developers to make sure we deliver successful projects for our clients. So I think with that being said, we can open it up, for questions. If anybody has questions, like Ramsey had said earlier, we can raise your hand and we can call on you and unmute you, and you can ask your question, or feel free to shoot it in the chat. We can pick them up and just take them one by one.
Yeah, a lot of people may not want to raise their hand and get on video, but yeah, in call messages is fine. Oh, there we go. Have a couple right there. So we actually have one from Morgan. Morgan Williamson says, should testing be done in the same sprint?
Awesome. Yeah, good question. The answer definitely, right off the top, I would say yes, right? With a lot of these questions, it is kind of what is your team format? Who's on the team? What's the structure of your team? So a lot of these questions, there's different versions of it depending on your team structure, and really the project and the company. But ultimately, the answer for that would be yes. A couple very popular methods that are coming out, especially within Agile. One is called shift left. Basically, that means we want to take everything that gets pushed forward in development. We want to have it get tested so we can kick it back as soon as possible. That's that way, right? It's quick feedback. One, that's helpful because it's fresh on everyone's mind, right? If you worked on something today, if someone gives you feedback on it later that day or the next day, you're going to be able to jump on that and take that feedback much quicker than if someone gives you that feedback a week later. You got to kind of refamiliarize yourself with what you're working on. And then two, the big thing is that allows us to make those adjustments and get it fixed, so we can get it fixed within the sprint, and things aren't getting transferred over into the next sprint. We don't have spillover. The other thing that kind of falls into that method is CI/CD, which is basically continuous development, continuous deployment. That is getting more and more popular. As you've seen more in the past, if you're familiar with software, you'll see much larger software development, like deployments, right? You'll have a big, huge version that comes out with 1 million changes, and they've got those huge release notes. That is helpful, and there's those pros to that. The negatives to it is it takes a ton of time to test, and even if you do endless testing, you're always going to have bugs because there's so many big changes that are coming through. So what's been becoming more and more popular is just continuous updates, where you're just making small changes in small pieces of an application or software. Makes it very easy to test, makes it easy to deploy, and it allows you to constantly be adding quality for your customers. But yeah, I would say, again, the short answer is yes. We really want to test and get feedback to the development team as soon as possible. So we always want to try to do that within the sprint.
Yeah, and that follows a lot of lean startup methodology, more of the business side rather than the technology side, but it still follows that to build things out as more compact, more quickly with an MVP to make sure that you're getting things out quickly and deploying quickly as well. So we follow that both on the business side and the technical side. So it looks like another question here. Who decides, from Jay DeBrava, who decides the duration for grooming product backlog?
Another good question. Typically, that is going to be the role of the either like project manager or product owner. They'll typically be the one in charge of more of the product related items, right? So they're going to schedule that call with either stakeholders that are going to be necessary on that call, the Scrum Master, and then sometimes even the development team to really look at the backlog that the product manager has put together, go through those tickets with the other people on the team that need to be there, and really make sure that everyone's crystal clear on what the deliverables are, what the reason for the ticket is, what's the features, why are we doing it, really getting everyone's feedback, making sure that's all inside of either the user story, epic, task, however it's broken down, making sure all those details are there and everyone's crystal clear on what the deliverable is. So then that way, one, the development team, right, is clear on what they got to do and what they're building. And then two, everyone from the product side, they're clear on when this is done, what is going to be included inside the application. That's helpful so I can use those features. And then also it's helpful for maybe even people on the sales team so they can go, pitch that to people, right? If they know there's a feature coming down, it's gonna be done at the end of the sprint. If they're clear on what that feature is, they can go sell that maybe ahead of time, or even set expectations, right, for people that are maybe using your software, and make sure that they're not giving giving promises for a new feature that's being rolled out that maybe isn't going to be rolled out, right? So we got to make sure that everyone is clear on what's being developed and what those timelines are.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks like there's actually a couple more questions regarding sprints from Morgan. So feel free to ask whatever you got.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll keep taking questions from you, Morgan. Got good ones so far.
This is seems like there tends to be spillover in a sprint. How can sprint spillover be reduced?
Awesome. Yep, good question. The short answer for this one is kind of a simple one, is better planning. I mean, that's 99% of the time when we have sprint spillover, it's because we didn't plan properly up front. That's a simple answer that, that requires a lot more details to delve into, but that is the short and sweet of it. A couple little bit more details I can kind of go into with more information is, when we talk about, well, what do you mean by bad planning? It could be something as simple as we didn't take into account that there's a holiday coming up in the sprint, right? Maybe we usually account, hey, we have 2 developers working on this. Each of them have 40 hours. We're doing an 8-week sprint. So, right, we got 80 hours per week. So you got 160 hours to work with. If you don't really look ahead and really plan and make sure to check the schedule and make sure you know that there's holiday, you're going to put 160 hours worth of work in there. That holiday hits, no one's going to make up a full day. And now you get to the end of the sprint, you're behind by 2 days, basically. So it could be something as simple as that, or, the more common thing is going to be something like the deliverables of the ticket wasn't clear, the acceptance criteria wasn't clear, some possible roadblocks or complexities weren't fully understood when we did the sprint planning or grooming. Another thing that can come with spillover that isn't necessarily tied to planning really is the velocity, right? So some teams fall into is maybe they'll do 1 or 2 sprints. They'll determine their team's velocity based off of that sprint, and then they'll keep that velocity all the way through the rest of the project. And that can create issues because maybe your team just had 2 really good sprints, and now their velocity is set really high, and they've never been able to hit that velocity again down the road. If you've missed 2-3 sprints in a row and it's consistent, maybe you're hitting the same velocity, maybe you're hitting 80 story points every single sprint, but your velocity that you want is 100. If you've hit 83 sprints in a row, maybe it's a good time to adjust your velocity back down to 80. Once you can hit 80 consistently, then you can try to push to get a higher velocity. But typically we're always trying to get the most out of a sprint, which is good. But ideally, the most important part of the sprint isn't necessarily getting as much done in the sprint, but also making sure that you're setting realistic expectations of what's going to be done inside that sprint. So just as important to push your velocity forward as it is to reel it back to make sure you hit your timelines. Awesome.
Okay. Yeah, and then there's a follow-up to that. It says from Morgan, and in an active sprint, what do you think about adding stories?
Yeah, good question. Typically, I would say the answer is yes, you can, but I would say it's frowned upon. I would typically push pretty hard to say don't do that or avoid doing that. As soon as you start adjusting or changing a sprint once it's started, it really kind of defeats the purpose of having a sprint in the first place, right? The sprint is to allow us to step forward, and I keep saying a 2-week sprint. That's what we use as a standard. Some teams like 3-4 week sprints, so that's another thing that can be determined by the team. But typically, the whole one of the main advantages of a sprint is you get it locked in, and you let the team focus in on those features, and it helps you keep a schedule, and it also helps keeping the team focused. If you're constantly going in and changing things, adding, removing stories, it's just always going to mess with your schedule and mess up your sprint. So, again, you can. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes there's an emergency or there's priorities, but ideally, I would try to avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, awesome. And kind of backtracking a little bit, because Jay during that was asking about any type of common sprint mistakes, planning mistakes specifically.
Okay, common mistakes. Oh yeah, I see it there. Yeah, I would say the common mistakes is probably the most common one that I see is like avoiding like reality, right? Sometimes we think about the best case scenario, and that's what we want to plan for. So we always just want to back into what's the maximum we can get done, and then that's what we always push for, which is good. But if we know, and I kind of go back to the user story piece, right? Like we know we hit a velocity of 100 user stories or story points one time. That's what we want to strive for. We know it's possible, so that's what we push for. But if we consistently aren't hitting that goal, we will, realistically, we need to know. Let's bring it back so we can have realistic sprints and timelines. Another, common mistake I would say kind of falls back into the planning part. It is, maybe just trying to cut a grooming meeting short or trying to simplify something. Say, yeah, I get that ticket when you truly don't or not asking enough questions. You think you understand the ticket, maybe the team estimates the ticket, then you get into the sprint and then you really dive into that ticket or that user story, and then you realize, oh wait, we have all these questions, maybe we don't understand. That's going to happen no matter what, but we really need to do everything we can to avoid that happening as much as possible. Every time you get into a sprint and then you have questions, that can really affect maybe the estimate or the timeline for that ticket. And now it's already in the sprint, so it can mess up your schedule. So I would say pretty much the most common mistake I see is people not fully understanding the deliverables of tickets or user stories before we move into the sprint. Then we run into that during the sprint, and that'll really mess things up.
Well, I think it's important to note on the sales side, we have a lot of different types of customers coming in. So clients from startups to those who already run teams, even big teams who are just looking for to augment their staff. And it can kind of be all across the board with what they know and how they come into that project. And so really for us, it's important on the sales side and the PM side to communicate very clearly with the client. And so all along that process, we really need to set up the expectation up front because some people think that everything's just going to run very smoothly, and especially startups, right? They come in thinking, you've done this for so long and things are just going to be done perfectly. And that's never the case, right? I mean, that would be practically impossible to do. But as long as we've set expectations that, this is how the project could possibly turn out, but along the way, there are going to definitely be some hiccups and maybe advancements from the original. So that's important to note.
Yeah, and real quick on that note, Brandon, you bring up a good point. I think a lot of the time for a lot of development teams, they've got stakeholders, right, which are usually people higher up in the company. So they feel that pressure Maybe it's from the sales team, maybe it's from an executive, and they come in and they bring in new things or new priorities. And I think a lot of people, if they've worked in this realm or this scenario, a lot of the time everything's number one priority, right? You talk to people on the team and everything needs to be done tomorrow. Everything's number one priority. Obviously, we can't have 20 number one priorities, right? So we got to kind of, and that's part of the sprint planning, right? We really kind of force it and figure out what are those number one priorities. And then when we start the sprint, it almost always happens. Somebody from the executive team, a stakeholder, maybe it's just somebody using the software that's on your team, will come in and say, hey, I really need this done as soon as possible. It needs to be done this week or next week, something within the sprint. That's something that's going to always happen. And we really, it's important for the development team to have that discipline, especially like on the project manager side, to push back on those, on the team or the stakeholders to keep the integrity of your sprint. If you allow people outside of the development team to kind of come in and decide those priorities or adjust the sprint, you'll never have a consistent or good schedule. Your schedule will constantly being adjusted and will always be getting messed up, and you'll never really be able to plan 1, 2, 3 months ahead because your schedule is always changing, your priorities are always changing. So it is really important, to again push back on adding stories to the sprint. And I actually think I saw Ramsey, you'd added that question too. Can you change stories mid-sprint? Those kind of all fall together, right? Same answer I'll give you for that one is it is possible, but highly frowned upon. If you get into it and you realize maybe that user story is not right, or we need to make an adjustment, obviously you got to do what you got to do. But really, we got to, we push to make sure all of that's done before the sprint. At the end of the day, the goal is to not make adjustments to the sprint once it's locked in. That's our ultimate goal.
Yeah. Well, and also when you're dealing with maybe a board or someone like that, executive team that you're following up with, a lot of them, I think the threshold nowadays is a lot better. People are understanding more of a lean or an agile process, but to challenge a board member can be a difficult thing. I think they should also understand how these work, especially like you're saying, if there's a major pivot or even a small one. I don't know how exactly to push back specifically on a board, but understanding these principles and helping them to understand really that old mentality of thinking, everything has to be done initially is really going to put them at risk. So the less risk that you can put into that project, again, going back to expectations and a little bit of challenge, I don't think ever hurt anybody. Let's see. We got a couple more questions. Let's see. Jay, again, what should you not do during sprint planning? Interesting question.
Sprint planning. Yeah, good question. I would say kind of similar answer, that I kind of gave before. It kind of falls into a similar scenario where it's, the short answer is, like avoiding reality, avoiding, if you're in the sprint plan, maybe there's a holiday coming up, or somebody's sick, or something that's gonna show up inside the sprint, or maybe there's a roadblock that maybe stressing everybody else, stressing people out, and maybe you've been avoiding it for a while, so you keep kind of pushing it to the rear, and nobody wants to talk about it. I would say the big thing for sprint planning is making sure that you're clear on what's going to happen during your sprint. We'll use the example of 2 weeks, making sure you're clear of who's going to be there, what can they work on, making sure you understand what are all the the roadblocks and dependencies that are going to come up, and then also avoiding, like I said, avoiding those hard or complex issues. That's something we see a lot of, especially like on dev teams. You want to try, people's natural instinct is to try to kind of avoid those difficult items or those things that are harder to nail down. They want to pick up those like easy to complete items. And what we've always found is you want to get those complex things out of the way first. It's the total opposite. Instead of delaying them and taking the easy items first, we really want to tackle those difficult items up front and address those immediately. And then the easy things will be easy to take care of down the road.
Yeah. Ramsey's asking, how many story points should a team tackle per sprint?
Good question. Yeah. This one is kind of a funny one because it is very dependent on the team. There's a lot of like different textbook answers, of how you should create those user story points. A lot of people like to start off with like the Fibonacci scale, and that's a good way to kind of break it up into chunks. Some people even break it up into just increments of 5 to make it simple, right? It's tickets either a 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. Maybe you go up to, go from 20 to 40, and then there's the last one that's too big. If it's over 40, that means you got to break it into smaller pieces. But some teams, their maximum story point might be 9 or 10. Another team might go all the way up to 40. Ultimately, the idea with story points is you're trying to get away from like using hours as necessarily a unit of measurement, because hours aren't necessarily always it's not, you don't have the same amount of hours every time. You don't have the same, one person can get something done in less hours than another person. So story points is basically a measurement of, how big it is and then complexity. So we kind of use it as a grading rule. And then what you do is you assign people out those tickets and then you back into your velocity. So one team might say, hey, our velocity for our team is 40 story points. Another team might say it's 60 story points. The important thing is you understand what that value is and you back that into tickets. And then you might have to take a couple of iterations, maybe 1 or 2 sprints to go through to establish an initial velocity, and then just keep that consistency, adjust your velocity, and eventually, after four or 5 sprints, you'll really get into that sweet spot with that team. So it's kind of an open question. It's very dependent on the team, but it's very important that team works together to establish what's the value of their story points, how many they want to fit in a sprint, and then just working that consistently. So it is very dependent on the team, dependent on how they're structured, and then dependent on who's in that team, their strengths and weaknesses. So it's just a thing that's really important to determine with the people you have on the team and how your team works. So I wouldn't push to have something consistent across every different team. I think it's really important to establish that for your team and then keep that consistent rule. So typically we like to use the Fibonacci scale for just setting up our points initially, and then depending on the team, we'll have different velocities for different teams.
Awesome. Hey, real quick, I just wanted to know, I noticed a few people have joined in, and one left. Well, they're dead to us now, but basically, kind of a recap. Anybody that's on the call, feel free to, you can either raise your hand, or if you want to do in-call messages and ask a question, feel free to do that. I am over the sales team here at Zibtek, and Colton is over project managers. And so that way you kind of know our roles specifically, but feel free to ask any questions that you want to. Looks like we have another one here from Morgan. Curious to know what you think about splitting user stories, and if doing that, can it still be valuable?
Okay, yeah, good question. I'm not sure if that means necessarily splitting the user story into several user stories, or splitting it into multiple tickets. I guess really to kind of cover both cases, typically what we like to do is we like to break a user story down into the smallest pieces possible, right? So sometimes a user story, when we first think about it, we plan it out, it can actually end up being a fairly big picture, right? So maybe it's something that's going to take 2 weeks to build and complete. So we really don't ever want something, a user story that's going to take 2 weeks to complete. So then what we want to do is really look and say, well, how can we break that down into smaller pieces? And the important part is, for that is, how small of a piece can we break it into where it's still a deliverable, right? So if a user story can't be deployed, can't be built and then added to the software by itself, then it's not a user story, right? A user story has to be able to be deployed and add value to the customers. So knowing that definition, we really want to break it into the smallest piece possible. So to answer that question, can we break it into smaller pieces? Yes, and actually that's highly encouraged. As far as maybe breaking a user story into multiple pieces where maybe it's not deliverable by itself, I would say no. The only thing that we would want to do that is breaking a user story down into subtasks. That's a practice that we do all the time. We say, what's the user story? We define that, make sure that's clear. And then we break that into multiple subtasks, which is basically tasks for either the developer, the designer, really on the team. What are things that need to be done to achieve that user story? So we always break it down into those smaller pieces to add up to a user story. But at the end of the day, the piece that actually gets deployed and pushed to production or pushed over for testing is the full user story in itself. Hopefully I answered your question for you, but awesome.
Yep, looks like it probably did answer his question. Let's see, what have we missed here? Any other questions that we've missed?
I think that's
anybody have anything else that you might be thinking, or thoughts? It doesn't even have to be a question. Maybe you can add something interesting and intelligent to the conversation. We're open to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you mentioned it for the people that have joined recently, but you can either raise your hand and we can, you can have you come out of mute and ask your question or add your thoughts, or you can, feel free to add something inside the chat as well.
Okay, yeah. And Ramsey's just asking one last question. Who leads backlog refinement?
Good question. So the way we do it is we kind of break it into two pieces. So ultimately the product owner is going to be in charge of making sure the backlog is set and ready to be picked up. And they're really going to run a lot of that, but a lot of the time the Scrum master is going to be the person that kind of runs that meeting and makes sure it happens. We break it into typically, the product owner has 100% clarity on what the product is, what all the user stories are, all the users, what are we working on? Why are we working on it? What are the priorities? What are the stakeholders' needs? What are the users' needs? And then the Scrum Master is responsible for making sure all of the tickets, everything within the ticketing system is organized. The sprint is planned, the work is assigned to the right person, velocity is set correctly. Everyone has the right amount of work, dependencies are, determined. They're really the person, like the organizer, right? So with that being said, again, to answer the question, when we get into backlog, refinement, the Scrum Master usually runs that call and is, the owner of that. But a lot of what gets put into that call, a lot of the information is going to be provided by the product owner.
Okay. And then Jay DeBrava again, how do you handle backlog that may happen as a result of splitting sprints?
How do you handle backlog that happen as a result of sprint? So I'm assuming that's splitting sprints.
Yeah, splitting.
So Jay, do you mean like possibly like you've got a sprint and then you've like sprint spillover, like something? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by splitting a sprint. I don't know if you can elaborate on that at all, but
yeah, just
okay.
Based on what you were talking about earlier.
So maybe spillover. So yeah, I think this is something that actually comes up quite a bit. A lot of the time, like, I mentioned before, we like to break things down really granularly for everybody. So it's really clear on who's working on what task and what the acceptance criteria is for those tasks. So a user story will usually be built up of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 subtasks that need to be completed to cover that user story. And at the end of the day, we break it down for clarity and give people, clear work and measurable work. But the ultimate goal within a sprint is to deliver user stories, right? If we complete 100 subtasks that are supposed to build up to user stories, but we never actually finish any of those user stories, we're not adding any value to the product or to the users. So let's say there's a scenario where you've got a user story, there's 6 subtasks to be completed for that user story to be considered completed. If we get 5 of those subtasks completed at the end of the sprint, and that 6th one is not completed, then that entire user story will actually get moved into the next sprint, and that will be considered, that user story was not completed. So we will basically mark that as it's basically pass or fail. It's either did it pass, was it moved into was it moved into deployment for production, yes or no. If the user story wasn't moved, then that entire user story is considered not in that sprint. It's got to get moved into the next sprint. And then what happens there is we have to then re-estimate just the remaining work, and then we'll just handle, okay, what's going to be left for that last subtask, make sure that's estimated and that's added in, with the velocity, and then we move on from there. So the important part for that is that really helps encourage what we call now I'm blanking on the word, of course, but we really like to swarm. That's the word I'm thinking of. We like to swarm. So we like to have as many people work on one user story at a time as possible that's efficient, because we'd rather have 2 completed user stories pushed out than 3 partially completed user stories. Because as I mentioned before, partially completed user stories doesn't help anybody. So we always try to encourage just trying to focus on one item, getting it done, getting it pushed across, and then picking up the next item. So that's what we're always striving for. It's really important for the users and the stakeholders to get those items into production and move forward, because at the end of the day, the people that are usually paying for the stuff or using it, they're not looking at your code, they're not looking at deployments, they're not looking at number of subtasks completed. They don't care about any of that stuff. They care about what features have been added to the software. That's really all they care about at the end of the day.
Awesome. I was curious, just on the audience that we currently have, do we know maybe what roles people are in? Are we talking mostly to business owners or more corporate? Are you in more of a technical role? Maybe we could add in the in-call messages just a few, if you don't mind responding, what your role is. Maybe a few people could do that. Don't be shy. We're just trying to build a community and find out what way we can best help people and what kind of conversations would be most interesting. There's a lot going on with technology right now, of course. And so in the future, when we do these, we want to make sure we're on point and answering questions that things that are interesting to everyone. Anyway, how long do we want to go on this? We're set for an hour. Are we going to do 30 minutes?
Yeah, like you said, I think we've got an hour set aside, so we're definitely happy to hang out as long, longer and answer any other questions. But I think if we run out of questions, then I think we're good to wrap up anytime. But
yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if there's any more questions, we can go ahead and answer them. But if there isn't, we can go ahead and end the call. Again, I'm going to be, I've recorded this so that if you've missed it, maybe Morgan has one more question, but we can wrap it up if everyone's done with their questions, and we'll be sure to send it out to everybody. So if you missed it, or if you came towards the middle, you can see the whole thing from the beginning.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think, Morgan, you got one more question for us? Oh, there we go. Awesome. Good question. I like all the questions, Morgan. Appreciate it. I'll make you a good PM with all the questions you ask. How often should backlog grooming happen? Really good question. Again, I'll kind of precursor this with, depends on the team and the structure, but ultimately, I think the textbook answer a lot of the time, and this is something that we follow generally, is once a sprint. As long as you have that one set meeting and you make sure that that's happening at least once a sprint, that will 99% of the time get the job done. Sometimes, you're in a team that's really dynamic, things are happening, you need maybe 2 to 4 times a week, and maybe those are just shorter meetings. But typically for us, on about 99% of our projects, we make sure that once every single sprint, we set at least 1 to 2 hours aside where we sit down with the entire team and we do our our backlog grooming together. Hopefully that answered your question sufficiently there, Morgan. Wonderful.
Yeah,
awesome.
I think also, we're open to people challenging what we say in our concepts as well. So, if somebody jumps in with another idea or another way to do it, not that either one's correct or whatever, but feel free to do that as well. So yeah, I think if we're kind of winding down on the questions and no one has any more, then I think Ramsey, we could probably end the call.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Colton. I know you guys are busy. Morgan, Jay, everybody else who asked questions, we really appreciate you guys being active and coming in and joining us today. And that's it. That's a wrap. We hope you guys have a really great day, and thank you for joining us.